Hey everybody, how you doing? Quick couple of tidbits about both aircraft crashes, the one in D.C. and the air ambulance, Lear 55. So first of all, foremost, the D.C. crash. Now, I see some things that are pretty disturbing coming up online, and but we all need to really focus that the soldiers that were flying the helicopter were military personnel, and they deserve our honor and respect. So keep that in mind. They also deserve our condolences to them and their family and their friends. No different than the people that were in the commercial airliner. So, in aviation, we have what's called the Swiss cheese effect, or the chain of events. Both mean the same thing. You break one link in the chain, the event doesn't happen. You misalign the holes in a Swiss cheese, the event doesn't happen. In this case, there is multiple blocks of Swiss cheese. And for this to have happened, um, there it was one in a trillion, because every single block of Swiss cheese, the holes had to align. For all the blocks of Swiss cheese to be combined into one big block of Swiss cheese and still have all the holes aligned. The chances of this happening are almost impossible. Um, so all of our altimeters, the altimeters of the aircraft, which tell the aircraft how high they are in reference to mean sea level. So if an altimeter says you're at 1,000 feet and on the ground your altitude is 900 feet, you're only 200 feet above the ground, but the altimeter is still going to read 1,000 feet. We call that your MSL altitude and your AGL altitude, mean sea level altitude and above ground level altitude. So in retrospect, if we're at 10,000 feet and we're flying towards a mountain that's at 12,000 feet and we're not over 12,000 feet, AGL, we're going to hit the mountain. Okay. So with that in mind, we calibrate these altimeters. We call it a pitot-static check. And usually we run aircraft up to their ceiling and don't waste our time going higher than that, because the aircraft's incapable of going higher than that, so it doesn't matter. And you're allowed a certain amount of error. So let's say our test equipment, which says you're at 1,000 feet and it's been certified and tested, so it is correct, it is at 1,000 feet with those barometric pressures. And the aircraft says it's at 900 feet. It's allowable. The margin of error changes with altitude. So when you're at low altitudes, 50 feet, 100 feet, 200 feet, 300 feet, 500 feet, the margin of error is different. It's smaller. And as you gain in altitude, your margin of error increases. So let's say, just for sake of conversation, I'd have to look at the chart again. I haven't done a pitot-static check for quite some time. But let's just say, for sake of conversation, the commercial airliner had a pitot-static check done, and at 1,000 feet, it was at plus 100 feet off. Okay, so it was reading 1,100 feet, just for sake of conversation, just so we can all understand how this could really add up when you're down so low. When you're at high altitudes, it's pretty forgiving. But when you're in this little bitty window of trying to thread a needle with multiple aircrafts in the same little tiny confined within a 100-foot window of airspace, this really comes to play. So the aircraft, let's just say at 1,000 feet, it was 100 feet off. So its altimeter is 100 feet off to the good. And let's say the helicopter is 100 feet off to the negative. Well, that'll work out, right? But what if they were backwards? Let's say the commercial airliner was off 100 feet negative and the helicopter was off 100 feet positive. Now you just took 200 feet, and that 200 feet of clearance they had is no longer there. So even the instruments in the aircraft read those instruments. Okay. So that 200-foot buffer that both aircraft could have thought they had really wasn't there. And the pilots and the crew would have never known it. So keep that stuff in mind. The other things is Swiss cheese. That's one, to test the person performing the tests. That's one block of Swiss cheese. Okay? The pilot of the commercial airliner, his decisions, actions, and what he did and how he chose to do things, his day, his feelings, his disorientation, his distraction, all adds to another block of Swiss cheese. And the co-pilot the same. And the pilot and the co-pilot of the helicopter the same. And now add the block of Swiss cheese of the air traffic controller. So you have all these blocks of Swiss cheese of all these key personnel that all these things had to align, had to come together into one big block of Swiss cheese, and not one hole misaligned. So think about it. In order for you to have won the lottery ticket, that printer at the lottery ticket place had to print that ticket at the exact time for its delivery driver to pick it up, to bring it to the place of which you bought it, and then 1,000 people had to show up before you, and then you had to pick the right ticket to buy, and then pick the right numbers. It's the same chances of this event actually happening. So that's what they call the Swiss cheese effect, and that's kind of what happens, and yada, yada, yada. Okay, so that's the DC accident. But one more time, I want to alliterate people. These are human lives. No human life worth more than the other. They served us. They worked diligently to be safe and to protect everyone's lives, including their own. It was 1 in a trillion % chance of that ever happening. And it's 1 in a trillion % chance of it ever happening again. So stop ridiculing and trying to find blame, and keep honoring their memories and their lives. Send their prayers and support to their loved ones. Honor their lives. We'll figure everything out later, and we'll do what we can to honor their lives again, to do what we can to prevent it from ever happening again. And that's the most important thing. So that's the DC accident. Let's look at the medevac accident. I've watched those videos quite a few times, and it appears to me that aircraft was on fire way before it impacted the earth. Now, it wasn't very high, 1,500 feet, 1,600 feet. For it to reach terminal velocity, it would have to be over 1,500 feet. Terminal velocity isn't very high. It's only a couple hundred miles an hour, or just under 200 miles an hour. So what could have happened? Well, first of all, let's keep in mind this is a Mexico rated registered aircraft. And only recently did the FAA and the NTSB in the United States help Mexico increase their maintenance and teach them and allow them to actually fly back into the United States and classify them as a Class 2 maintenance class. We would be considered Class 2 and Class 1. In most cases, general aviation Class 2 and commercial would be Class 2, Class 1. I'd have to look that up, so don't quote me on that. But just recently, and I think it was July of last year, the United States recertified Mexico as a Class 2, or designation of Class 2 maintenance level. So, with that being said, that's your maintenance records. So let's look at that and what could have happened. Now, thermal runaway in a Lear 45, the batteries are contained into a steel box and they're vented overboard. So even if it was thermal runaway, for the main batteries, they would have been able to land pretty safe. I mean, that would have to have been something pretty catastrophic, and I'm not kind of leaning that way. But the fact that they didn't make a radio call or something, so something happened to happen really, really fast. The batteries are usually located in aft of the aircraft, and all the avionics and all that stuff's in the nose of the airplane. So most of it is anyway. They might have some potentiometers and other stuff in the back, and servos and magnetometers in the back, but other than that, most of it's all going to be up in the front. Radar, navs, comms, stuff like that, transponder, all that stuff's going to be in the front. So I don't think it's that. But one of the biggest mistakes I see in GA as a certified aircraft and power plant mechanic, we are trained in the handling of oxygen in its liquid form, not in its in its gas form, not in its liquid form. And the oxygen tanks that are on the board of the aircraft, when they're mounted in it, they're under a complete different IFR or FAR's laws. They're not considered hazardous because they are mounted, they're aircraft certified, they've been hydrostatic checked. They undergo a 100-hour inspection, and a phase inspection or an annual inspection. So they're inspected and maintained all the time, and they go under hydrostatic check. So those tanks are removed from the aircraft and they're hydrostatic checked, and then they're reinstalled in the aircraft. But one mistake that I do see that does happen in both GA and commercial aircraft during the installation and removing in the installation of these tanks is people not cleaning their tools. Now, oxygen itself isn't flammable. The air that we breathe is between 20 and 21% oxygen, the rest of it's nitrogen. So, and that air to gas to oxygen to nitrogen and some inert gases, that's the same all the way up to 50, 60,000 feet. So when you gain altitude, you don't run out of oxygen. What happens at high altitudes is you run out of the pressure. So barometric pressure here on the ground is 299 or 0.5. So 29.95 pounds per square inch of pressure pushing on our bodies all the time. And our bodies need that 29 pounds, 0.95. And it ranges like 23, I think, to 32, 40. Anything higher than that, that's great. Just helps us breathe a little bit better. But what happens is the membranes in our lungs need that pressure to push the oxygen through the membrane into our blood cells to become enriched with oxygen to circulate that oxygen around our bodies. That's what happens. So when we gain anything over 13,000 feet, we start suffering, we start having problems breathing because we don't have the pressure on the outside to allow that oxygen to saturate or penetrate that membrane to get into our lungs. It no longer can get into the bloodstream. It doesn't have the pressure to do it. So what we do is we pressurize the cabin. And we usually keep it around, 7,000, 8,000, 9,000 feet, around there. That way your ears don't go completely bonkers and shit like that. But that's what we do. That's why they're pressurized cabins. They're not oxygen-rich cabins. We don't take oxygen and put it into the cabin so you can breathe. That's not what happens. But when you're put into an oxygen-enriched environment, and an oxygen-enriched environment is anything over 23% oxygen. That's considered an oxygen-enriched environment. So when you're breathing pure oxygen, it's easier for your body to make that transfer because it's oxygen-enriched. So that's why we put the little thing in our nose or put our oxygen mask on. And that gives us that the ability to be able to get oxygen into our system. Okay, so that's that. When we service these tanks or remove them and put them back in, and you don't clean your wrenches, anything that has hydrocarbon in it, Vaseline has hydrocarbon in it, hand lotions have hydrocarbons in it. Anything that contains hydrocarbons, gasolines, anything that's flammable, oils, liquids, those oil on your skin. If you contaminate the inside areas that is exposed to oxygen on an oxygen tank and you leave a residue of hydrocarbon behind it, and that oxygen, pure oxygen, comes in contact with that, it is possible that it becomes a very, very, very explosive mixture. It would need an ignition source because oxygen itself isn't flammable. But if it had hydrocarbons combined in it, it is extremely volatile. The other thing is that they are at 2,500 to 2,800 pounds of compression. So if that tank ruptured, it would be a bomb. Whether it caught fire or not, the release of that amount, you're talking 8,000 times of the tank's volume inside that tank, be it whatever size, doesn't matter. Whatever volume it is, it's got 8,000 times the volume crammed into that tank. And that release of that type of force would be extremely volatile. And we go back to the Mexican thing again. It's from Mexico. I don't know how they maintain their oxygen tanks for the medical service. Those tanks get beat around pretty bad. And if one of those tanks ruptured, it'd have been all over. It would more than likely next to another tank, which would have transferred that energy to the other tank, releasing the energy of that tank, and it would have been a domino effect. The other thing that I've seen with oxygen, portable oxygen tanks, and being an ambulance crew and a firefighter, I seen a bad regulator that had residue from the EMT had Vaseline on his hands, and he disconnected the patient from the truck's O2 and put it on the regulator and got Vaseline on it, and the regulator was faulty and it was leaking oxygen, pure oxygen, came in contact with that Vaseline, a static shock, a static discharge from static electricity, set it off, killed the patient, almost killed him, and destroyed the ambulance. So there are faulty regulators that could cause this whole catastrophe too. So I'm kind of leaning towards the O2 tank faults on this thing because it happened pretty catastrophically. But the points are really into the DC thing. Remember, these are human lives. They've got loved ones. husband, wives, children's, moms, dads, cousins, aunts, uncles, and friends. Just to name a few. Keep them in mind when you're throwing around all these faults and trying to blame people, okay? So, peace out to y'all. Nothing but love for ya. Blue skies.